Hello and welcome to Season 9, Episode 13 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop,
I'm Mark Bishop.
and we are, of course, reading Orestes Brownson's The American Republic, Its Constitution, Tendencies, and Destiny, this time talking about Reconstruction. It looked like I cut you off there. Were you about to say something after you said, I'm Mark Bishop?
Yes, I would like to share something very important. Now, I was just thinking, I am now at Bishop World headquarters in my office to try to help with the internet connection, and I
Hmm.
think much better, much more quality. I also feel like I've been lacking in my somewhat random rants this season,
Mm,
and we really haven't figured out a way to reference Tolkien at
that's
all.
true. That's true.
Mm.
We have to work on that.
Yes. So I'm going to try to somehow weave that in.
I'll be,
Speaking of weave, I've seen some recent interviews of Trump. That he calls his kind of stream of consciousness interview responses the weave. Have you heard that?
I have not heard that.
In I don't know that it's intentional, but he claims that's intentional, that he goes off onto these tangents and then he weaves it back in on a
Hmm,
theme. And his big speeches,
yeah.
his rally speeches would just seem to go on forever and ever. And he says, I call it the weave, the weave. By the way, today, as we're recording on Sunday, the 20th, Donald Trump was working at the fast food window at a McDonald's
I saw that. That was crazy.
to highlight his claims that Kamala never worked there. And he says that McDonald's just verified that she never worked there. I don't know that McDonald's did that, but you would think that she'd produce a photo or
You
something
would
to
think, but
embarrass him. But I suspect she was never a fry cook at.
that's true. Even if she was, he can now claim that he was better at her than every job that she has ever had in his like one shift, at the fry station at McDonald's.
Yeah, I loved the interview with him having the apron on. Uh, where he's looking out the drive-through window at the press gas
Yeah.
across the drive-through lane, and he says, "I have now worked at McDonald's for 15 minutes longer than Kamala Harris."
That's great. Did you
That
see
was,
his jokes at the what was it the Al Smith dinner? That was
yeah,
pretty good too. That was good.
I thought he did a pretty good job. I mean, I don't like roasts
Mm,
generally. I don't like insulty jokes, and I wish that the Al Smith uh would get away from those try to encourage not having personal insults of the other person.
yeah.
I mean, I think he was funny, but I think insulting jokes about the other party is funny. I think his
Hmm.
jokes about Chuck Schumer were
Yes,
great
those were great.
because I think they were like a true roast should have an underlying theme of affection and love for the
Hmm.
person that you're criticizing. I thought some of his were a little too mean
That
spirited.
is true. But it was
Uh,
far better than Kamala's weird little video she sent. If you watched that, that was just mocking Catholics with some woman who I guess was like on SNL, and that was like
oh
an
yeah, she
SNL
was.
character. I didn't know who that was. It was just an obnoxious like person making fun of Catholics in this horrible, awkward Kamala Harris video.
People my age forget how little you know of our era of entertainment.
Hmm.
And Mary Catherine Gallagher was this character name, and she was a recurring character at least one season, maybe two seasons. And she would say at the end, she'd fall over, and then she'd say "superstar," with her hands up and kind of down on one knee. And it was like a spoof of a stupid Catholic schoolgirl that was really oddly behaved and kind of weird, and to put her in weird
Yeah.
situations with other people. So
It
so
was an interesting choice for a Catholic like charity dinner event, though. That was odd.
yeah, and the character itself was somewhat of an homage, if I could use that word,
Hmm.
to Catholic school education, but was generally critical
Hmm.
of Catholic schools and priests and the Catholic Church in an era where the Catholic Church, was really this is during the big scandals,
Yeah.
the molestations and that kind of stuff. If I remember correctly, I think it was concurrent. And so, yeah, it was a really weird choice. I had read somewhere, but it's probably inaccurate because I don't even know who they had to attribute it to, was that was Mark Cuban's idea,
Hmm.
which sounds like a stupid thing that he would think would be funny.
Yes.
because Mark Cuban is really stupid.
Hmm.
And I don't know how these people that are so stupid make all this money.
Yeah.
You know, I think maybe Trump is right. The whole system is rigged.
Yeah. Well, they've
He's
had
just,
all sorts of weird blunders on the left, like weird political moves, like the horrible Gretchen Whitmer video, if you saw that, with
yeah.
her just like the weird blaspheming the Eucharist thing with that female reporter, and also just Kamala's performance on interviews and stuff lately. Like even when it's friendly, it's been really awkward and weird, and yeah, it's
Oh,
been
yeah, like I think
mess.
Trump's joke about she's somewhere getting communion from Gretchen Whitmer. I thought that was pretty funny
Yeah.
because I don't think that was really that mean against Kamala. It was just highlighting a really weird anti-Catholic thing.
Hmm.
Well, the newest thing is, she's some person at one of her rallies yelled out, "Jesus is Lord."
Hmm.
I believe she did not hear them because she's just probably assuming that they were saying something against her, and she says, "Well, you're at the wrong rally." Well,
Hmm.
now the Christian advocates are saying, "Well, it's she's anti-Christian.
Yeah.
She says at the wrong rally. What is she, a Satanist?" And so somebody yelled out, I think today at JD Vance, Jesus, Christ is King. And he interrupted his speech. He says, "Darn right, Jesus Christ is King." Yeah, everybody's cheering and all that stuff. So they're going to
That's
exploit
funny.
him.
Yeah.
Like,
All right. Well, we should probably talk about the chapter here. We've been going on about Trump and Kamala. So that's one rant out of the
wait,
way.
is it Kamala or are you racist? Did you say, are you a bigot? Did you say it the wrong way?
I don't know, because now at this point, I don't remember which one's the correct way. Because I feel like every time I say it, I feel like some leftist is going to sneak up behind me and say that I'm saying it wrong, no matter which way I say it.
Those leftists are always sneaky. They never come up to the front. Well, you're in good company because she's pronounced her name twice.
Hmm.
Either
Yeah.
way, depending over the years. But I just thought I'd accuse you of being a bigot because
Yeah.
I.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Um, But yeah, he starts off this chapter, Orestes Brownson, back to the book here. And he says, I like the point that he makes in this first sentence, because I think he was kind of wrong about this, but he says, essentially, the question of Reconstruction will probably be over by the time I'm finished writing this chapter, and it'll all kind of be solved. But, here's my thoughts anyway. And of
Yeah.
course, Reconstruction was not solved, within a few months of 1865. And so I just thought that was funny to look at that and look back on it and see, yeah, I don't think he was quite right about that one.
Sure.
But he says that going back to his point in the last chapter about sort of the United States' approach to the Confederacy is entirely confused. And he says, what they're proposing right now doesn't really make sense, and it shows that the American people have only confused views of the rights and powers of the general government, but imperfectly comprehend the distinction between the legislative and executive departments of that government, and are far more familiar with party tactics than with constitutional law.
Mhm.
And I think he could say that, right now too in 2024. Absolutely. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, I thought this chapter was really interesting and how he goes through and says, you're really treating them as if they're still states, but that doesn't make sense with how you treated them in other things.
Mhm.
And essentially just goes through this list of you have a completely confused view of what the United States are, going back through this chapter.
Yeah, and I think he does make great points. A lot of it. Now there's a whole section on
Yes.
the black vote. What? Where's this coming from? So I guess you'd say, given the benefit of the doubt, he's a man of his times,
Hmm.
which I think is a reasonable take, a reasonable evaluation of people at all times. But in any event, yeah, I think he's right in the sense that there are a lot of forces going on, and there's um, a lot of theories about how the Reconstruction, a lot of arguments about
Hmm.
how the Reconstruction was to happen.
Hmm.
There are punitive, the radicals that really wanted to punish everybody in the South. That tried to have their way, and that, of course, killing Lincoln really cleared the field for
Hmm.
them in a very real sense because Lincoln, everybody kind of expects that if had he lived, he would have been certainly as magnanimous as would have been allowed.
Hmm.
I think, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. But yeah, it's like, okay, well, what is it? Um, were they treasonous? If in that case, then you got to start hanging them.
Hmm.
And then he does mention, that the pardon, the presidential's pardon that was issued, and originally, if I remember correctly, I think Grant did that as part of the surrender with Lee, even though he didn't have the authority to really
Mhm.
do that.
Yeah.
If they laid down their arms, then they were free to go back home and be, I don't know what the term was, unmolested or unharmed
Mhm.
or whatever. I mean, practically you had to do that. Also, you'd have another war
Yeah.
because at some point, you can only do so much before people are forced to fight
Mhm.
against you.
Yeah, and that's a point that he makes later is that, they remain American citizens and they have to be welcomed back in as full American citizens with no, you can't take away their right to vote. You can't treat them as territories. They're states within the Union. If we don't accept them as American people, we're going to go right back into the same war. If we keep trying to punish them for the things that they did now, then it's just going to make things much, much worse from here on out.
Yeah,
Um,
I think. Well, I mean, I wanted to say one thing, well, two things. One, I like his quote on this first page of the Reconstruction, where he
mhm.
said, "It is in some measure characteristic of the American government to understand how things ought to be done only when they are done, and it is too late to do them the right way." That's really true. And so I think he's kind of has a premonition
Mhm.
that it'll get done right eventually, but maybe for all the wrong reasons,
Mhm.
technically or legally or constitutionally. And he probably had a sense that, well, they're going to be, so to speak, brought back into the fold,
Mhm.
but he has issues with the process and the law and who has the power to do it.
Mhm.
And the question is, okay, well, was this a personal treasonous rebellion, or was this the states itself rebelled? And he's kind of hit on these themes a number of times through this book, which I think they're important theoretical constitutional topics to
Mhm.
discuss in theory. And he talks about, okay, well, if it's the state, are they now to be treated as territories,
Mhm.
which we discussed, I think, in the last chapter, and what is the question is, okay, what did they do, and who is they? Like as far
Yeah.
as the rebels, the secessionists, and his argument seems to be that they had, in a sense, a good faith argument to believe they could secede,
Mhm.
but that position has been refuted under force of arms.
Yeah.
I think that's what his
Mhm.
bottom line decision on whether or not you should, I don't know, you say forgive and forget, but you should let them back in
Yeah.
into the union and not consider them to be
Mhm.
traitors, and that the states cannot be reconstituted.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
kind of what he says, like he has that whole list of questions on page 152. And I thought this was an interesting question that, I never thought about. But he says, is there reconstruction, their erection into new states, or their restoration of states previously in the Union? Do
Right.
they remain the same, or do we have to have sort of the general government come in and reshape them into new things, have them approved by Congress? Because if they did actually revert to being territories during the war, sure, you have to readmit them by the,
Mhm.
the same process. And with that, I know he kind of mentions a little bit later, but like the case of Virginia where we
Yes.
did do exactly that, where we split Virginia in two, and we have this new state of West Virginia that has to be reorganized as a new state entirely and isn't just sort of readmitted as it was, 4 years prior. And so it's
Right.
like we tried to mix and match depending on the situation. I think he kind of argues is we should have just taken one stance and gone with it rather than trying to apply things differently here and there. But
Right. No, it's a good point, and I think it was discussed. Okay,
mhm,
what are we going to do with all these people? What about the property rights? Are they gonna have are they gonna have the same rights? Meaning like South Carolina, they hated South Carolina.
mhm,
Um, is South Carolina going to have the same electoral votes? Are
yeah,
they going to have any electoral votes? And how long is it going to take for them to get back in and be established to be part of this community again?
mhm,
And on and on and on. And that was the real struggle at the time, because there were a lot of people killed
mhm,
in this war. You know every family was affected
yeah,
uh, by it,
mhm,
and so they're interesting questions, and
yeah,
and he
and
raises these theoretical issues. I don't know that they're that
yeah.
practical,
But I
really.
do like how he kind of explains things here, like the contradiction, because he says, the government thought that no state could secede. There was no power to secede, and so when they said they seceded, they were all still states within the Union.
Yes.
But he says, yet it proclaimed 11 states to be an insurrection against the United States, blockaded their ports, and interdicted all trade and intercourse of any kind with them, And he says then the Supreme Court decided that the war was not a war against individual personal insurgents, which would be the case if they were still states and it was sort of a personal battle against these armed insurgents, but it was a territorial civil war. And so you have this contradiction where it's the government still saying, no, you're states, but we are treating you as an outside force, a territorial war where the states, are waging war on us, and it's not a personal thing. And so it's these two entirely different views of what the states are and what the relation is during the Civil War. He says, we can't just have this weird confusion continuing, right? We have to clear this up, and that's what he tried to do in the last chapter and is doing in this chapter here too.
Yeah, and I think the answer is both.
Mm-hmm.
The federal government used both analysis concurrently at the same time because you had different factions that wanted different things, and
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately everybody wanted to get past this at some point and and get the Union back. And I think just practically speaking, other than West Virginia, I don't know that anybody had a real appetite to split anybody else up.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm trying to remember, but I was thinking there might have been like, was it East Tennessee? And I know there's
Mm-hmm.
an area of Tennessee that was loyal to the Union. They were persecuted during the war.
Mm-hmm.
And Lincoln, that was one of his highest priorities, is trying to liberate that area. And it took forever due to a lot of stupidity on the part of Union generals and mismanagement before those people could be so-called liberated. They were pro-Union. But other than that, I don't know there really was an appetite. I think at some point there people are just like, let's just leave it. There's already a structure kind of there. Let's
Mm-hmm.
just reconstitute it and get them back in and resolve this. But he's right. It's like, okay, well, if it's the states are in rebellion, they ought to have to be readmitted as if they're territories. Maybe go through a period of territorial governance. I mean, I think there was military governance, of course, at first because
Yeah.
Grant and Sherman had conquered them, as the generals. But Sherman very quickly appointed local leaders
Mm-hmm.
and granted them a tremendous amount of autonomy almost immediately after conquest,
Mm-hmm.
after his march to the seas. And so a lot of that was kind of a fait accompli at some point because it's
Yeah.
like, of course, he did a lot of things he didn't have authority to do. He just did it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the kind of that
Yeah.
way.
And I like what he says now, kind of on the bottom of 153 into 154, where he's talking about like the government's initial approach to the secessionists, where they hope to just kind of like support the people who were loyal to the Union and kind of just weaken the secessionist movement. And they hoped that kind of, when things or if things did go south, then they'd still have like a good majority, at least a plurality of like Union people loyal to the Union who would kind of work within the state to bring things back. But that's not what happened. When the state seceded, all of the people who were somewhat loyal to the Union were like, well, I'm part of my state. I kind of have to go with them. And there were, of course, exceptions to that rule, but they found that they couldn't, rely on that to weaken a seceding state and try and, politically move them back into the Union, which I thought was an interesting argument that he made.
Well, yeah, and further, those people were a minority
Yeah.
because the vast majority of people were in favor of it
Hmm.
within those states. All the representatives were in favor of it. I'm trying to think. I mean, of course, I'm not an expert in Civil War history, but I don't think there was a whole lot of dissent
Yeah.
from any elected officials.
Because
And
what he says is, even those who were, somewhat loyal, they still held the state sovereignty theory. So if my state decides this, I'm in the minority here. My state is still sovereign, even if I think I have practical claims that we should be part of the union. I still have to go with my state. My state's sovereign. I mean, that makes sense. It's a logical argument there.
well, famously, General Lee was offered a position in the Union Army
Hmm.
before he went
Yeah.
south because he was loyal to Virginia, which
Hmm.
was yeah. Um, but yeah, he talks about this distinction as we're talking about, like this it's a territorial rebellion and not a personal rebellion, and so you're not really dealing with an individual. I guess you are dealing with the individual state, but you're not really addressing the individual people
Hmm.
necessarily for personal involvement if it's a territorial secession. Um, and I think he mentions, I think it's in the end of 154. Again, the states ceased to exist
Hmm.
upon secession and the conquest or the defeat of those secessionist elements. And he talks about on 155, he's talking about I think he's talking about the people in the South. They were free members, not of a confederation indeed, but of a higher political community.
Hmm.
Reconstruction should restore the identity of their individual life, suspended for a moment by secession, but capable of resuscitation. So, like, basically bring them back in
Yeah.
as citizens of the United States. And then you have to figure out practically, okay, which regional government are they going to be? Is it a new state? Is it
Hmm.
the existing state? But that they're, um, they're still part of the United States, which I think was generally felt by both sides at that point in the
Hmm.
struggle. Although there are a lot of people in the North that were really not happy.
Yeah,
To put
and
it,
that's what he kind of addresses. I like what he says, about Virginia a little bit higher up,
yeah,
where he's kind of, addressing those people who would like to see, the South, punished more severely. He says, "Who would see old Virginia, the Virginia of Revolutionary fame, of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, of Monroe, the Old Dominion, once the leading state of the Union, dead without hope of resurrection?" He's like, "That's what you're arguing for. This is part of our history. Even if you were in the North and you were part of the Union, Virginia and all of these other states, they are part of the United States' history, and they have such a great history."
mm,
That we should be, gracious to them, and we should welcome them back in and have them as fully as part of the union because they are part of us. We're part of that same body. As he says, the United States are one, system, separated into smaller sort of not necessarily sovereignties, but ruling areas essentially.
right, right. And he does allude to a certain excluding certain people from uh, who voluntarily took part in the rebellion, which is on the end of
Hmm.
155. Because there were, well, like that's one of the arguments against Trump.
Hmm.
One of it wasn't one of his impeachments oh no, after his impeachments, he was no longer qualified because he led
Hmm.
an insurrection. And so they're using that constitutional provision about the disqualification of those people that actively rebelled against the Union, which is, I mean, factually speaking, is quite a stretch. But of course, he wasn't convicted, and there were no actual pitched battles, no matter how many um, tear gas
Hmm.
canisters and what are those called? The sawhorses and barricades were pushed
Hmm.
around and stuff. But anyway,
Yeah, and I like what he says. He continues on in 156, where he says, that the work that has to be done is reconstruction, not creation, right? We can't just create a new government from anew. That's not going to work because, these are part of the Union. They have to be part of the Union, even if they, cease to exist during the Civil War. We're just reconstructing them as states. And I like what he says. He says it cannot be done exclusively nor chiefly by the general government, either by the executive or by Congress. He says, that government, you can appoint military governors, essentially, like in times of crisis. But we're not
right.
in a time of crisis anymore. This is peace. Reconstruction is the work of peace. And so we have to give it back to the states to reconstruct themselves. If you
Yep.
want, the general government sort of imposing a government onto this people, again, that's just going to lead to more resentment and more war in the future. You have to give it back to the states to sort of reconstruct themselves.
Well, and his point is, like I said, you said at the beginning, is that that you lose that jurisdiction once the war's
Hmm.
over.
Yeah.
Once they lay down their arms, well, then the military force, except for to complete the surrender, shouldn't be in place within the United
Hmm.
States times. So he was pretty aggressive on that point of view because there were a lot of people at the time that wanted to keep military installations to keep down the South and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So I think he makes very good points there. Um, he does. He says in the next page, 157, which I think I take an issue with. He's talking about mistakes that are made about the power of the government, the federal government, to kind of go in there and reconstruct it or whatever the case may be. He says there are two very common mistakes. The one that the states individually possess all the powers not delegated to the general government, and the other that the Union or the United States have only delegated powers. And he goes on to talk about that, about the sovereign is neither the general government or the states, severally, but the United States in convention, which is his main thesis.
Hmm.
I think he's wrong about that, about the two mistakes people make.
Hmm.
I think that the states still have all the powers not delegated to the federal government within the Constitution. I mean, it says it, the 10th Amendment, for crying
Yeah.
out loud. So I don't know where I mean, I think he's talking about his original sovereignty argument
Hmm.
there. And he's
Yeah.
saying, well, yeah, yes, that there's some delegated authority within the Constitution between the state governments and the federal government,
Hmm.
the general government. But I think he's making the argument that the sovereignty, the actual existence of the people of the United States, is when it has the authority based upon the states united in a
Hmm.
constitutional convention, essentially.
Yeah.
Which I get, but I don't know why he thinks it's such a mistake to say that the states do have all the powers that are delegated to the federal government. I
Yeah,
don't
because I
understand.
think he's kind of making a semantic argument that's kind of nitpicky, I think. Because I think it's really like he's saying it's not that you have, one government up here that has these powers and then one government down below that has all of the powers that they don't have, right?
Yeah.
Because what he's saying is it's all one government, and within that one government, within that one structure, you have certain powers up here and certain powers down here. But it's not that you have two governments working independently. It's all one thing. But again, I think it's weird how he brings it up in the way that he does, and he's kind of just restating, what he said earlier, I think.
Yes, I agree. But I put in my margin. Nope.
Yeah.
That was my counter
Yeah.
argument to that.
And I do like what he says, continuing on. He says, civil society in the particular state does not rest on the state alone, nor on Congress, but on the United States. And that's kind of where he's going on from there. He says a little bit earlier, secession has not dissolved civil society or abrogated any of the laws of the disorganized state that were in force at the time of secession. So kind of going back to his arguments about the American Revolution, too, where it's not, we didn't just create civil society from new, in 1776 or 1787. Civil society still existed. And even in this changing structure, we can still live peaceably now. This is still the same civil society we had beforehand. We just got to get over this hurdle of the Civil War and Reconstruction and things like that. But that civil society still exists and can exist in the United States.
Yeah, and I guess I mean, what's his bottom line on this? Does he believe that they didn't secede? I mean, isn't that what he's saying? They didn't actually secede, but then
Hmm.
he says, well, then they're really, if they did secede, then they're territorial
Hmm.
territories.
Yes. His argument is, I think, to lay it out simply, is you can secede, but you don't secede and become a new separate government. If you secede, then you just exist as a territorial possession of the United States because you can't secede into nothingness, right? Some power still has to exist. And so he says when they seceded, they essentially just dissolved the state, and the United States as a whole has the authority to come in and quash the rebellion and restore order.
Yeah, I guess. Well, yeah, because he says on 158, he asked the question, "What do the people who secede lose by the secession?" And he answers it a little bit later in the paragraph. Precisely what is shown a territorial people gain by being admitted as a state into the union.
Hmm.
So, so I still don't know if he's really saying that these 11 states, the secessionists, I think it was 11, um, are now territories, and then they could just be readmitted as states, or is he saying, no, they didn't secede because that's not what they intended. They intended to try to
Hmm.
rebel and have formed a separate government instead of just saying we secede and now, it's a territory. And I don't really know what his
Yeah.
point, what is he really, what's the bottom line? What do they do? What were they doing?
Hmm.
I don't know. He says what they were doing. Does he?
I think, I mean, this is kind of going back to last chapter, but I think what he's saying is secession as a concept just does not exist in the way that they tried to use it. Because
Yeah.
when they said secede, really what they were doing was just dissolving, right? Because the states themselves do not exist as separate countries, sort of in a confederacy. They're just entirely mistaken on that point alone. And
Yes.
so by seceding and trying to become their own separate unit, you're really just dissolving the government that currently exists within your state and sort of just leaving room for the general government to claim you as a territory instead of one of the contingent states, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
You
Yeah.
don't seem convinced.
Well, I mean, I'm really struggling with what his ultimate conclusion is in this chapter
Yeah.
about how to do the reconstruction. I mean, he doesn't actually, unless I missed
Yeah.
it,
Well, this chapter
he
seemed,
doesn't actually say their
yeah.
territories. We can name them, the state of Bronson.
Hmm.
Have 20 states in there
Yeah.
because they're territories, and
Well, because I think his argument now is, once the Civil War is over and once you are now claiming that you have not seceded, you kind of cease to your dissolution ceases to happen, right? So you're
Mm.
no longer dissolved government. You say, okay, we're not trying to secede anymore. We acknowledge that we are still part of the union, and now we can just sort of go back to the system that we had. We can reconstruct the system that we had prior to when we mistakenly tried to secede and actually dissolved.
Yeah, I guess that is true. I guess he's saying that the manner in which they claim to secede as separate states,
Hmm.
which would have been within the United States, but still basically is a very a duplicate system.
Hmm.
I mean, the articles, the Confederacy, their constitution was very similar.
Yeah.
The United States Constitution just had other states and some minor changes, of course, slavery and all that. But I guess that's what that is what he's saying. Well, they
Hmm.
didn't really secede in the way that the only permissible way it is to secede, which really
Yeah.
isn't much of a secession. Who would want to do that?
I guess the South.
I guess, well, they didn't though.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like under his theory that a secession would be the state is dissolved, like the state of Missouri is dissolved,
Hmm.
um, but it's just a territory governed by the national government.
Yeah.
I guess like my example that I had the last one, which is we really just we just hated our state government. We just decided, screw it, we're going back to a territory.
Hmm. Yeah.
Hmm.
Maybe.
Well, if the lefties have power in the federal government, solid power, and they're able to, but I don't know why they would, but I guess if they wanted to dissolve one of the states so that they could be governed by the federal government, I guess that there might be a way to do
Hmm.
that, and it would make sense. But
I think it would have to be the reverse though, because I don't think he's saying the federal government has the power to dissolve a state, but it's like when the people of the state try to secede, that makes it dissolve. So it'd make more sense if it was like, um, I guess the people of like a state that wanted to be governed by a left-leaning federal government would have to do that themselves. Yeah.
yes, but that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I
Okay.
was trying. I kind of paused because I'm like, well, you would only do it if you controlled a majority of the state and you controlled a majority of the federal government,
Yeah.
because you wouldn't want to do it with an opposing faction in charge of the federal government.
Hmm.
But you can only do it in the state if you already have a majority in your
Yeah.
state.
Hmm.
So why wouldn't you just change the laws so they just mirror image of the federal? So I guess
Yeah.
I don't think there's a really unless it's just such a corrupt. If you have enough people rise up at like a totally corrupt state government, which California would be a good example,
Hmm.
that that could happen.
Yeah.
Because if you dissolved California, then you could be readmitted as more than one state.
Yeah.
That might make that could be a theoretical possibility. Is if everybody like if half the people in California hated the other half of people
Hmm.
in California, or maybe it's like 2/3 hates the 1/3 and the 1/3 hates the other 2/3 enough, they might all agree rather than trying to split off a new state. They would just say to hell
Yeah.
with it, we're just dissolving it
Well,
and do a territory, and then maybe we could draw new lines and get Congress to
yeah.
approve 2 or 3 new states.
Yeah. When the point about, I think you brought it up of like Washington, last episode. I guess that would be like the reasoning there with the state of Washington, where it's
Mm,
like you have the West Coast, Washington crazy liberals, the Seattle people who have nothing really in common with the eastern side of the state who want to become part of like Idaho.
right.
I guess that would be what they would want to do, where we'd say, okay, we kind of just dissolve, the east side of the state. That's no longer part of the government of Washington. Federal
Yep.
government, you can reorganize us as a territory how you like. We would like to be part of Idaho or maybe our own state or something like that. I think that would have logical sense there.
That makes sense. Yeah. I guess you'd lose as a state, you lose a certain number of electoral votes, I
Yeah.
guess, is your congressional representation. But anyway, yeah. So
Yeah.
I guess there's a theoretical possibility that his theory could be put in practice, but it'd be
Mhm.
pretty
It'd be
rare.
pretty hard. Yeah.
But I mean, it's a different analysis than I've heard trying to deal with those issues of a substantial minority in a state that is politically
Yeah.
opposed to the majority.
Hmm.
California is one example. Washington's another one. You have it in Missouri, but it's just those two cities on either side of the
Yeah.
state.
I mean, parts of Illinois would be interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, because it's
Southern
very,
Illinois,
Chicago is crazy, but then Southern Illinois, as soon as you get out of the urban area, it's pretty similar to Missouri.
everything south of Cook County would
Yeah.
love. They love to have their own state. I don't think they join Missouri, but
Maybe not.
join Indiana. I don't
Yeah,
know.
possibly.
But yeah, I think because I went to law school in Carbondale, and
Hmm.
that's really rural.
Yeah.
Anything to do with Chicago.
Yeah.
Uh,
Interesting.
yeah, I mean, so you go certainly south of Springfield. It's a whole different state. It's
Hmm.
agrarian, rural. I mean, it's yeah.
Yeah.
Must be an eye-opening experience being elected as a state rep in Carbondale, Illinois, going up to Springfield for the state legislature,
I bet.
and getting outvoted on everything by all those people just from like the one city. They
Yeah.
dominate.
No kidding.
All right.
And then he kind of goes on. He kind of talks about, separation of powers in these issues, where he's essentially saying that the executive has no authority in the matter of Reconstruction. That's all in the legislature, right? Because we give them the power to, admit new states in the Union. The executive really shouldn't be bothering with stuff like this. And this is a similar issue. So he makes that sort of point, which wasn't, terribly interesting, but I think makes a certain amount of sense. Um, but yeah, it essentially kind of repeats himself where you can't just be a military governor forever. You have to have, the people reorganize themselves essentially, because, like I said, the Congress again has the power to erect, provisional governments and things like that. I'm trying to remember what
Yeah,
else
I
he mentions
mean,
here. Yeah.
we kind of already covered a lot of this stuff about the people being vanquished
Hmm.
and the president's pardon power only. He takes a position that the president can only pardon you after conviction.
Hmm.
I think it's a pretty limited view of it, and then I don't think it's correct. I think you can pardon people before they're convicted. You
Yeah.
certainly can pardon them when they're charged because there's notice of it. But then there's an argument of, well, if you accept a pardon, are you accepting that you were guilty? Um, the commutation is different. That the commutation is just a reduction in
Yeah.
sentence. Pardon is to say, well, you're guilty and I'm pardoning
Hmm.
you. Guilt, kind of like going to confession. You first have to confess your sins before you'll get your absolution.
Yeah.
And so he's saying you can't even get, so like that Lincoln's actions initially, and then all these other these broad pardons. I would tend to agree with a certain extent that I think the pardons. I don't like these broad-based pardons. Carter did it after the Vietnam War for the
Hmm.
draft dodgers, um, and he pardoned everybody and that was just kind of like everybody was kind of happy he did it. I mean, I was a young child, but I think that's true that it's like you don't want to have to prosecute all these people that fled to Canada so they wouldn't get drafted for the Vietnam War. Although maybe they should have, but like the pardon power has gotten so distorted now because the pardon power is used in immigration now
Hmm.
as a broad-based power to not enforce the law
Yeah.
or the criminal violations for immigrants, or it's a commutation or a deviation of that, or some derivative of that, I guess I should
Hmm.
say. And I do think that I don't like these broad pardons of groups of people. If you can't put a name to it, I don't think it's a pardon.
Hmm.
So it has to be, I pardon Mark Bishop for murder in 1972 or whatever. I was 2 years old. I was very violent. So that I would
Yeah.
agree with them on. I don't think that he
Hmm.
have to be convicted to get a pardon. I don't think that's a correct statement of law currently, but
Yeah.
anywho, so
Yeah.
he
And,
talks about those kind of issues
mhm.
and the management of it, and what's the are these really still Americans?
Yeah. And I like
Uh,
what he says. He's talking about the difference between the individual versus territorial responsibility. He says, it's essentially 7 million people. He says, and 7 million, or the half of them, are too many to hang, to exile, or even to disenfranchise. He says, the interest of the country, as well as the sentiment of the civilized world, might almost be said to the law of nations, demands their permission to return to their allegiance, to be treated according to their future merits, and as an integral portion of the American people. Right, so
yes.
you have 7 million of these people, and they are American citizens. You cannot hang 7 million people. You can't exile them, and you can't even, say you don't now have the right to vote anymore. right? And he says I think what he says is like their defeat and the like loss of their like worldview is their punishment, right?
Mhm.
The acknowledgement that secession was terrible and that you didn't really have a right to do that. That's your punishment. And I think that's something that can should probably be remembered today because I think people are still trying to punish the Confederacy or the descendants of them, for owning slaves or things like that, where it's like, now we're even farther removed from it. And you still have all the talk of reparations and things like that of, how we need to still punish these people for their crimes that happened 150 years ago or more.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you think it's still going on? I think that's going to be dead in the next year. Don't you?
I mean, I think it's still talked about at least like worldview wise, because I mean, you still have like the systemic racism thing where it's like, white people, because of, the actions of people 150 years ago are essentially more privileged than any given black person just by the color of their skin, which is of course very racist and untrue. But I think it's still like I don't know if people are really arguing specifically for reparations, but it's still present like in people's minds for sure.
Well, California voted for it, and the St. Louis City is looking at reparations. If I remember correctly, they had a lawsuit against the Rams and the NFL, and they got a big boatload of money, and they've been not doing nothing but arguing over it since. And one of them, they were studying paying reparations and to people in St. Louis City as part of that payout in that one, which is kind of funny because I think, well, of course, the mayor is black. I think a majority of the aldermen are black. It's like, well, wait a second. I mean, I don't know. It just seems weird when the oppressed minority, so called, is a
Hmm.
majority and controls power. I mean, they have. I mean, it's just weird. I guess there are still people talking about.
Yeah.
I'd like to maybe forget about the stupidity of it. I feel better about America the less I think about these stupid theories that come up from time to time.
That's fair. That's very
uh,
fair.
Yes, but he did. I did want to mention we're in this kind of this section here. He mentions none but a coward kicks a fallen foe, which is kind of like
Hmm.
this similar thing that you were talking about there. But um, he says on 163, it says we should remember that none of the secessionists, however much in error they have been, have committed the moral crime of treason. They held with the majority of the American people the doctrine of state sovereignty.
Hmm.
On that doctrine, they had a right to secede and have committed no treason, been guilty of no rebellion, which is a pretty strong statement. So he's trying to assert that well, they're individually they had, like I said, I think he's basically saying they had a good faith argument. Of course, it went about it the wrong way, and they're wrong, and that's been decided
Yeah.
against their favor. So they didn't have any criminal intent. He says
Hmm.
there can be no just punishment. There has been no criminal
Hmm.
intent. He says that 164.
Yeah. And I like
Uh,
how he compares it to the Roman Empire too.
mm,
Because he says, the Romans had a lot of civil wars. And the
yeah,
Romans had a lot of, external wars. And, of course, when they won an external battle or something, you'd parade the general through the streets and it'd be a whole big thing. But they never did that with civil wars. If it
yes,
was a war fought against Romans, you never, had this sort of demeaning parade where you would, have the victorious general amongst the defeated people. He says, we have to remember that. We
yeah,
cannot, just keep beating the South over the head with, yeah, we beat you, we won, you're terrible people. Look at our great generals and how they demolished you and burned a lot of your towns and things like that. Because essentially for the same reasons we've been talking about, you have to reintegrate them as full citizens and not just start another war by continuously haranguing them over the
yeah.
years.
Well, there's a reason why taunting is a penalty in the NFL. If it's a blowout victory, it's bad form to taunt a vanquished foe.
That
So
is true.
personal foul, taunting. So I don't know what else he wanted. He does talk about the voting, the suffrage. He calls it the Negro suffrage issue.
Yeah.
Um, and he says there's no power in Congress to enfranchise the Negroes, he says, in the
Hmm.
state needing Reconstruction. And once assured of their freedom, the freedmen would care little for the Union, of which they understand nothing. I mean, that's a pretty horrible statement, I think.
Yeah.
I think he's just completely wrong in this section where he's dealing with the suffrage of the freed slaves.
Hmm.
But I guess my most, like I said at the beginning, my most charitable interpretation of this is just a product of his times,
Yeah.
and he just doesn't think that they should be allowed to vote. I
Yeah.
mean, they're lesser, they're not citizens, I guess. I mean, he doesn't come out and
Hmm.
say that,
Yeah.
but he says there's a matter of indifference to the union, and the elective franchise is not a natural right, but a civil trust, because he kind of alluded to that at the
Hmm.
beginning, that not, a natural right to vote, I guess. Uh, and friends of them should, for the present, be contented with securing them simply equal rights of person and property. I'm like, how do you secure that as a group when you don't
Yeah.
have a vote for the representatives who are going to secure that right? I
Hmm.
mean, I just, he's so brilliant in some other areas, and on this issue, it's just so, I don't know, inconsistent, and just
Yeah.
so, it's like a blind spot for him. Like he
Hmm.
doesn't see. I guess he just doesn't see the slaves as equal humans. I
Mm.
mean, that's the only way I could view it. I
Yeah.
just understand, because he assumes that they're going to vote the same way as their master.
Hmm.
I mean, of course, I had no experience with slavery, but I'm guessing I would hope that they would vote, the opposite at least half the time of their former
Yeah.
owners, so to speak. I mean, they were never really legally owned. I think the whole legal system was not legitimate. So I don't,
Yeah.
I don't
I
consider
mean,
them slaves.
yeah.
They were enslaved, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The only argument like that I can see, which is for the times, I don't agree with him, of course, but it's like kind of going back to why it was only like landowning males at first. It's like people with a vested interest in the country. So it's like you were a man, but you also had to own land and things like that to show that you were, part of this state essentially, and you have a vested interest in the state, and that's why women weren't included, was because like it is the household that votes
Mm.
was kind of the understanding of voting rights and things like that. And so I can kind of see if you extend that to like, well, they haven't been landowning in the past and they're not like part of their own communities because they were within the community of the slave owner. Like, ugh, kind of if you stretch that enough, but still, yeah, I think it's a terrible, like you say, it's a blind spot for him because he's brilliant on other things, but this is just a really bad way of looking at it.
And he doesn't make that argument either.
Yeah,
You
that's
know,
true. That's true. I'm trying to be a little more, I'm trying to come up with
charitable.
something for him here.
You're trying to be charitable because he's not making the argument that they are not invested in the community. He's making an argument that they don't have the capacity.
Mm,
Now, granted, that there was a lack of education, because they didn't want their slaves in a lot of cases to be able to read and write, and
yeah.
they, a lot of people didn't think that they could.
Hmm.
Um, it'd be a waste of time and effort, or whatever the case may be. But yeah, so it's it's a strange thing for him to assert, and um, it's not a theoretical argument
Yeah.
similar to the other ones.
Hmm.
It's really a practical, um, in its own way, discussion of a contentious issue.
Hmm.
He's not talking about the constitutional rights of the freed slaves. He's talking about whether or not it's practical to allow them to vote.
Hmm.
Really saying,
Yeah.
well, why bother? At some point, he doesn't allow for that, though. I think he does say, because he talks about the taunts of women. The prisoners marched into Richmond. That it was worse than from the taunts of the freed slaves were harder to bear.
Yeah.
It's about those things, but he does mention. Um, I think he mentions the possibility of it happening in the future. He just says it shouldn't happen now because they don't. Yeah, I guess it's
Yeah.
kind of a creation of an interest,
Mhm.
best
Yeah,
interest.
because what he says is he's kind of treating them all as very basic utilitarians.
Yeah,
Because what he
right.
says, like talking about slaves who fought for the Union, he says their freedom secured. The only reason they fought was so that they could have their freedom. That freedom secured, they have no longer any interest in the Union, and their local attachments, personal associations, habits, tastes, likes, and dislikes are Southern, not Northern.
Yeah.
And so that's talking about why I guess they shouldn't have the right to vote in the North either,
Mm.
which is it's weird, but I guess it's kind of that vested interest idea, but it doesn't make any sense, because they do have a vested interest in this country. A lot of them had lived in the United States, and their ancestors had lived in the United States for hundreds of years.
Mm.
And so they must have a vested interest, and of course they would, and they need that right to vote.
And well, he does say in towards the top of 167, the suffrage will no doubt come in time as soon as the freedmen are prepared for it.
Hmm.
Danger is that it would be attempted too soon.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I mean, that's the argument for Jim Crow. I
Yeah.
mean, because they had literacy tests, they had all sorts of restrictions to prove that they were capable. That was the justification for the literacy tests.
Hmm.
And of course, if you went in there and passed that test, you're in trouble. I mean, that's what would happen.
Yeah.
What are you coming in here for? I'm going to take that literacy test. I learn how to read and write. I want to vote. Oh, okay. Well, here, pass the test, and then they take them out back and beat the hell out of them, or
Yeah.
worse. I mean, that's how they enforce it, because then I better not take that literacy test. And that lasted until really, like the 1960s.
Yeah.
I mean, that for what, almost 100 years, we had a system like that in a lot of areas. So yeah, I don't have anything good to say about it. The only thing I could say is it's a weird discussion. I think it was an important discussion at the time. So I guess
Hmm.
he was brave in the sense that he took it on,
Hmm.
writing contemporaneously about it, and he was brave in a little bit, in a way, saying it's going to happen. They're just not ready yet.
Yeah.
So maybe that was a revolutionary thought for a
I
lot of
guess. Yeah. It might have been, but
people.
still, it's
Because
rough reading it now.
yeah, well, and there were a lot of racists in the North. All
Yeah.
right,
Oh yeah.
so there it's not like the people north of the Mason-Dixon line were paragons of virtue with regard to race relations. So okay, they they didn't want to like him either, and they had concerns with freeing them. You
Hmm.
know,
Oh yeah.
and so because they didn't consider them, the slaves, to be equal
Hmm.
status.
Yeah.
And not even if they're freed, they didn't consider them
Yeah.
equal status. It
It was
wasn't just
just
that.
so weird when I was reading the chapter because so much of what he writes is like so easily applicable to now, and I think he's right, and a lot of his theories are absolutely correct. And you read that, it's like, what? Where is this coming
Right.
from? That doesn't line up with everything you've been saying so far. But I guess it
Whoops.
was 1865, and I guess that's the most charitable view you can give it.
Yeah. Well, he didn't have a whole lot of foresight in that one, I don't
Yeah,
think.
no, I don't think so either.
It's hard. It's hard when you're in that society to see how effed up it is
Yeah,
sometimes.
true.
I mean, you look back on this era, and 20 years from now, you'll be like, golly, people are crazy.
Yeah, true. Very
Who
true.
knows, 150 years from now, what they'll think of us. Mm.
Not a lot of good, I'm sure.
On that note, I don't know.
Yes. All right. Well, do you have any other final thoughts for this episode? Any other final rants you want to go on?
No, do you?
No, I don't think so. I think I've been through all my rants at least.
Very good.
Oh, I did buy it to bring Tolkien into it. I
Ah,
bought some more Tolkien books the other day that I
I,
found at a Barnes and Noble.
I didn't.
Um,
There were any Tolkien books you have not already had or read?
there's some out there that I still don't have. But one of them, well, I have a lot of them in some form. One was The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, which is a collection of poems and stuff, which I had like within a collection of other like poems and short stories. So I had it, but this was like one with commentary and stuff like that. And then I found a book on the I think it's called The Literary Lives of the Inklings. So him and C.S. Lewis
Oh
and
yeah.
Charles Williams and one other that I'm forgetting, like Barfield,
That
Owen
was
Barfield. Yeah,
that was
those
like
guys.
their little club,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Um, that was one of my biggest disappointments in the which one would have been the Lord of the Rings, the
Mm-hmm.
Tom Bombadil character.
Yeah.
He was like my favorite, well, one of my favorite characters from reading the novels,
Hmm.
and I was disappointed he didn't even make an appearance,
Yeah. Yeah,
because
that is disappointing.
he's a pretty cool dude,
Yes.
a righteous dude, as they would say in
I think those are the words Tolkien used to describe him. Tom Bombadil was a righteous dude, and Sam and Frodo met him on the road.
it's a reference to Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Yes. All right. Well, that's my side tangent, I guess. Do you have any other final thoughts for this episode?
No,
All right. Well, you can, of course, still follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I have been Adam Bishop.
still Mark Bishop.